Hey students, and welcome to 12th grade government class. This is the week 4 notes. And as you can clearly see, this week we're going to be focusing in on the executive branch. There are 3 branches of government in the United States and in most countries around the world today. The Constitution of the United States outlines all 3 branches. The first article of the Constitution outlines the legislative branch, and we talked about that last week. The Constitution gives more information about Congress than any of the other branches, and a lot of people assume that means because the legislative branch is the most important. Because of how much media the president gets, some people think that the president is the most important branch. But I think that could be highly argued, especially as the founders anticipated how the presidential job would look. And then over time, that morphed and changed. And so over time, the power and the office of the president has grown exponentially. So that's what we're going to focus in on today, the executive branch as established by the U.S. Constitution. You can see here the seal of the President of the United States. Okay, and I always like to ask an essential question to make sure students are focused on what we're supposed to be learning. What is the executive branch of government in the U.S.? What is it called? And what are its powers? So again, the first article of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch. The second article of the Constitution deals with the executive branch. And the third article of the Constitution deals with the judicial branch. And so I'd like to just do a quick review of the 3 basic branches of government in our country, as established by the Constitution. Again, there are 7 articles or pieces or parts of the Constitution, and the first one deals with the legislative branch. The main job of the legislative branch is to make laws. The president does not make laws. The executive branch does not make laws. The president's job is to carry out the laws, okay, or to execute the laws or enforce the laws. The judicial branch, its job is to evaluate the law, or a lot of people use the word review the law, as in judicial review. So the legislative branch is called Congress in our country. It has 2 parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Last week, I tried to go into detail about those 2 parts of Congress. They collectively make up one branch. There are 2 senators from every state. So when our country first started with 13 states, there would have been 26 senators. Now that we have 50 states, there's 100 senators. The House of Representatives, the number of seats has grown as the country has expanded, starting with 13 original states, and now we have 50. But presently, we take the population of the United States basically divided into 365 seats, although some of those seats are given to the District of Columbia, which is not a state, and some of the territories like Guam and Puerto Rico and American Samoa and stuff. So it's not exactly that way, but each state gets a certain number of representatives according to the state's population. But every state gets at least one. Today, we're going to focus on the executive branch. And obviously, that's the most visible because we can almost put the executive branch into one person. It's not one person, but we kind of personify it into one person, and thus it's easier to talk about in the media and to give credit or give blame to one person than 535 people in Congress, right? That's difficult to do. So the president gets a lot of press, and over time, the office of the president has grown a lot. But when we say executive branch, we mean the president. And of course, there's a vice president whose job is not really to do much, except if the president dies, they take office. The vice president is actually the president of the Senate. So the vice president is actually the president of the Senate, but they have a president pro tem of the Senate who does the day-to-day work. Because it takes so much to run the country and there's so many things going on, the president gets to select a cabinet, and we're going to talk about that. The Senate gets to approve, right, of who's going to be on the cabinet. So the president just can't pick anyone. He has to pick people that the Senate is going to approve. But the president does have a lot of power to pick his running mate as the vice president and pick people to run the offices, the different departments of the executive branch. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and the other federal courts. So I'm not going to go in depth into that right now, but there are 9 Supreme Court justices that are nominated by the president. So that's, I think, something very important to talk about when we're talking about these notes here today, because we're focusing in on the executive branch. So the president gets to pick the Supreme Court justices, and they are approved by Congress. So that's part of this checks and balances process. But the Supreme Court justices get to serve for life. So that's one of the main things that people talk about, one of the powers of the president. When I'm recording this, the current president of the United States, the 45th president of the United States, is Donald Trump, and the vice president is Mike Pence. And they're up for re-election in 2020. And so we'll see how that goes. It's kind of exciting when you're doing a government class in a presidential year. If you're watching this video after 2020, you could obviously always Google who the current president is and vice president. But that's the current president when this video is being recorded. In my notes, which you can find on my class website, I often embed videos that I find are interesting. And if we're sitting in class, I often show, so you can kind of get an idea of some of the current trend that's happening. And so I'll make reference to those throughout. Here's the basic breakdown of the executive branch, the president. The president is the executive branch, and he enforces the law. We have had this, Donald Trump is the 45th president, and every single one of those 45 presidents has been male. So that's why I clearly put the he. It could be a woman, it just hasn't. There are lots of other countries around the world who have had female leaders, but the United States, as of 2020, has not. Okay? The president is both the chief of state and the head of government. The head of government is the person who actually is in there running things, doing things. He actually in an office, making judgment calls, signing papers, having meetings. That's the job of the head of government. The chief of state is like the figurehead. So if you go to a country like the United Kingdom, the chief of state would be the queen, and the head of government would be like the prime minister. They're both part of the executive branch in the United Kingdom, but in our country, the president serves both roles. The president appoints a cabinet to help him with his job. And I'm going to go over the details of the cabinet in a minute. The most important position in the cabinet is the Secretary of State. Another important one, probably next in line, would be the Secretary of Defense, and then the Secretary of Treasury. Those are the original cabinet positions, and so they kind of hold a little more clout than the other positions that were added later on. The next position that was added is the Attorney General, the top lawyer of the land, that person who is going to make sure that the law is enforced literally in the court system. Things are prosecuted. That's a fancy word that we use in court systems when the government is trying to actively hold somebody accountable to the law that has been given to prosecute. And then, of course, the person who's in court would want to defend themselves. And so that's the defense. Okay. The cabinet right now, as of 2020, has 15 departments headed by a secretary. So again, there's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, etc. All of them are referred to as the secretary of their department, except for the Attorney General. Okay. And we'll hit that in just a second. The president has the power to veto laws he doesn't like. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, and I'm trying not to overly complicate this, but the president cannot make any laws. If the president is making laws, that's not constitutional. Congress makes the laws. And laws can basically start in either house, either house of Congress, the Senate or the House of Representatives. And as long as one side, like say a law starts in the Senate and is approved, then it goes over to the House of Representatives and is approved, then it goes to the desk of the president. If the president signs the law, then it becomes law. Okay, that's what transitions it from being a bill, that's a law being made, to an actual law. Okay, but if the president doesn't like the law and he doesn't want to enforce it, he has the power to veto the law. If he vetoes the law, that means he's not going to enforce it. It goes back to Congress. If Congress passes it, through both houses a second time without changing it, then the president has to enforce it. So the president can only veto a law once. If something is changed in it, then he could veto it again. So there is some complexity, but that's done on purpose. The president is the commander-in-chief of all U.S. armed forces. The president cannot declare war, though. Only Congress can. So this is interesting, and it's kind of one of the ways in which presidents kind of get around things. After World War II, when the United States was the first country to test and use nuclear weapons, at least the atomic bomb, and then later we developed thermonuclear warheads during the Cold War. From the 50s all the way up until the 90s, we were in the midst of this Cold War and almost fighting World War III. And so nobody wanted to declare war. So it kind of became just the tradition for presidents to send troops to different places without declaring war, because only Congress can declare war. So after World War II, the President of the United States sent troops to Korea. We sometimes call that the Korean War, but technically the United States never declared war. Then in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. presidents sent troops into Vietnam. And again, it was bloody and thousands of people died, and we dropped more tonnage of bombs on Hanoi and North Vietnam than we did on Germany during World War II, but we never declared war. The presidents used executive orders to move troops around, but then they had to ask for Congress to extend those troops staying there. But nobody really wanted to declare war, really because we had nuclear weapons, and everybody was scared to use that word in case the other side, the Soviet Union or the Chinese Communist Party, would declare war back, and then we'd find ourselves in World War III. So I think that's important to note. Only Congress can declare war, but the president does have the ability to move troops to places around the world quickly, and he can keep them there for a certain amount of time until he gets congressional approval on the budget. To be a president, according to the Constitution, there's really 3 rules, but 2 of them are the most significant. To be president, you must be at least 35 years old. The founding fathers of our country who wrote the Constitution wanted to make sure that we didn't get somebody in there who hadn't developed some maturity and experienced life and, understood all the consequences of actions. And so nobody can be president of the United States unless they're at least 35 years old. And they have to be born a citizen. So if you move from another country and you become a citizen of the United States, you will never be it's never available to become president. You can run for Congress, you could be a senator, you could be in the House of Representatives, you could be a Supreme Court justice, but you can never be president unless you were born a citizen. The other rule is that you have to actually live in the United States for a certain number of years, but mostly people who are Americans live here in the United States. But that was one of those things. They didn't want people who were born in the United States and become a citizen and then grow up their entire lives somewhere else, and they don't understand what it is to be an American. So that is the third piece of it. As I discussed before, every president gets to select who they want to run the different offices, the different departments, and you can see here what each one of them are. The Secretary of State is generally considered the most important. Secretary of Treasury and Defense are the next 2, and the Attorney General. That was the original when George Washington, he called as Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and he called as the Secretary of War Alexander Knox. Knox was the Secretary of War, but later we changed it to the Secretary of Defense because that sounds a little nicer. Henry Knox. Excuse me for saying that wrong. And then, of course, he did hire a lawyer to serve the Justice Department as the Attorney General. All the rest of them were added later, from Secretary of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and the most recent one added was the Secretary of Homeland Security, and that was added after 9/11 to try to get the different governmental federal, like the FBI and the CIA and other branch pieces of the Justice Department to work together. So the Secretary of Homeland Security working with the military and such, that's the most recent. So sometimes people step on each other's toes. Some people might say, well, all the military falls under the Secretary of Defense. And the Secretary of Homeland Security might say, well, yeah, but we need them to do this. And so sometimes they step on each other's toes and such. But this is a group of people. There are men and women who serve, and they meet with the president regularly to take care of all the things that the executive branch has to do. Okay? Again, George Washington only really started out with 3: state, treasury, defense. And then, of course, he added in the attorney general. So most people would say that he had 4 people in his original cabinet. Okay? You can go on to whitehouse.gov if you want to see who the current cabinet members are, but they meet and discuss things with the current president. And I've attached a link right there if you want to go and look at names. You might recognize some of them, but you might not as well. Inside of the first cabinet, when George Washington was president, is kind of where political parties were born. There was 2 really strong-minded members of the original cabinet. There was Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And they both loved the United States. And they both wanted our brand new country to be successful. But they both had very different ideas on how to fix the problems that we had. Hamilton, he wanted concentrated power in the federal government, where Jefferson wanted the power of government to remain in the hands of the individual states. So they kind of, they argued a lot with each other. I think that Washington was smart to get people from different perspectives. If you are a good leader and you just get people who agree with you, then you're never going to see the entire world the way it is. You need to get people to work for you who have different point of views, but are super smart. And Hamilton and Jefferson were definitely that. Okay, Hamilton, of course, he thought that we should be siding with like the British. You can see down here I have 2 different charts that kind of lay out some of these differences. Whereas Jefferson said, well, we got French help during the American Revolution. They're really our allies. And so they kind of disagreed on who we should have as allies. Jefferson believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't actually say it, then we can't do it. It's got to be like really put in the Constitution. And Hamilton said, well, the Constitution's just a guideline. It's not an exact rule. It's more of a guideline. And as these 2 guys kind of fought, and they didn't actually like punch each other or anything, but they went back and forth, arguing back and forth, and we start to see the beginnings of political parties. Now, George Washington warned against this. He said that if factions arise in the government, they'll only look out for their own good and not for the good of the entire country. So he highly discouraged having factions, which of course become political parties. But Alexander Hamilton, the people who kind of bought into his ideas, they called themselves Federalist, that is, having a strong federal government. And those who supported the Thomas Jefferson side of things became known as Democratic Republicans. At first, they were kind of called anti-Federalist. But they slowly changed their name to Democratic Republicans. Now, interestingly enough, today, we have both Democrats and Republicans. So you can see how both political parties try to get their roots back to the origins of our country. Other than George Washington, almost every president of the United States has been a member of a political party, but it hasn't always been Democrats and Republicans. But we'll get into that here in a bit. Now, how is the role of the presidency expanded? Here's the president of the United States and some of the powers that are granted to him. He can approve or veto all bills passed by Congress. Remember, a bill is a law that's being made by Congress. As soon as the president signs it, it's a law. If the president doesn't sign it, says, no, I don't like this law, that's the power of the veto. But it can be overrun. Congress can push a law on the president, okay? Prepare the federal government's budget, okay? Is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So the president is the top commander. People take their orders from the president. Out on the field, of course, they're listening to their commander, and that could be a lieutenant or a colonel or a general, but everybody's getting their orders from the commander-in-chief, and that's the president. Here's one of the things that people talk about. It's probably one of the most famous powers of the president. The president has the power to pardon those who are guilty of crimes against the federal government. Let me just say it this way. If you break a law and the federal government is going to throw you in jail and the president says, I forgive you, you're out of jail right then and right there. It's called the power of the pardon. The president can pardon any person in the United States for any crime. So you got to be careful with that. If the president just goes around forgiving everybody, then he can get a bad reputation and he could lose his job. But lots of times presidents will wait until their last day or two in office because the media is paying attention to the new president coming in. That's oftentimes when presidents will write out their pardons and forgive people. It could be somebody who did something really, really, really bad, and the president could forgive them of that crime, absolutely wipe their slate clean. That's the power of the president to enforce the laws. Conduct U.S. Foreign relations, make treaties, and receives foreign ambassadors. Each country has representatives that they can send to other countries. Those are called ambassadors, and those ambassadors work at embassies in different countries. He can appoint cabinet members, ambassadors, and federal judges. Okay? Keep Congress informed about the state of the country. So it's tradition that like once a year the president will stand in front of Congress and give a State of the Union address. In the Constitution, it just says it should be done regularly, but it's kind of become an annual thing. And propose laws and programs to Congress. So the president, again, cannot make any laws, but can get his buddies in Congress to make laws, and that's kind of significant. Okay? This right here, you can see across is where, this is Washington, D.C., This is a river called the Potomac, and on the opposite side of Washington, D.C. in Virginia is the Pentagon. That's where the U.S. military meets together. It's close to what we'd call, well, a place called Arlington. So what I'm going to do is just zoom out for a second here on Google Earth and kind of just show you where I'm looking at right here. And if I jump to you can see a little bit better. This is Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. If you go in between Virginia and Maryland, we find ourselves in a small cut of land called the District of Columbia. This, of course, is the Potomac River right here. And if you zoom in on Washington, D.C., this is the Washington Monument you've seen in movies, the Lincoln Memorial. This is the White House up here. This is the U.S. Capitol where Congress meets. And across the street is the U.S. Supreme Court. So you can kind of see some of the pieces. And of course, you can go grab Google Earth or Google Maps and check it out for yourself. Now, there are formal powers that the president has and informal powers. The formal powers are the ones that are written down, and the informal ones are the ones that have been used over time. They're not actually written down, but then you can kind of see how those are differentiated, okay? There are sometimes what they call implied powers. That is, because of past examples of presidents, current presidents or future presidents will do certain things. We use the word precedents The president can set precedents. In other words, if a past president has done something, then the current president can say, well, I can do that too because it's been done by other presidents. And those are sometimes these informal or implied powers. It kind of depends on which one you're looking at. So you can take time and kind of look over these. I'm not going to go into every single one, but there's plenty of time to pause and kind of look at it. Things that are explicitly said in the constitutional, some things that are congressionally delegated, things that are implied, like if you read the Constitution, you can see how past presidents felt like they have that power. Informal, again, are ones that are just, they've been done in the past and a precedent has been set. And that kind of also applies to these implied powers. Again, I have a ton of videos that are embedded. I highly recommend you go and check them out on my website. Some of them I will show in class to help students understand how these powers of the president are currently being used. Okay, why does the government work sometimes and not others? If you've been paying attention in this class so far, you know that we've divided the power of our government up into 3 separate but equal branches. That means that there's a lot of people who are sharing the power. And that means in order to get anything done, you've got to get a lot of people to agree. And that's the purpose of dividing the power up, is so that one person or one small group of people doesn't get too much power. And it means that government runs slowly sometimes, but it also means that one person doesn't become a dictator or doesn't become a king or emperor. And that's exactly one of the reasons that we divided the powers of government up when our country first started. This is not a history class, it's a government class. But sometimes we might use history to kind of help us understand how things got going. Our first president didn't become the president. George Washington didn't become the president until the Constitution was finalized and the first elections were held. So the Constitution of the United States was started in 1787, and by 1788 it was done and mostly agreed upon, but by 1789 it was in full force and we got our first president. And as George Washington was leaving office, he gave a farewell address. And again, I've already mentioned, but I'll just briefly touch on it. He warned against the growth of factions and political parties. He also warned against the growing sectional tension between the North and South. And as you know in a history class, we do have a civil war. And there was major differences between the North and South in the United States back in the 1700s and especially during the 1800s. He also recommended that the United States stay neutral when European powers went to fight. So Washington's farewell address, the first president, gave our country some great advice if only we had listened, right? Okay. Remember, political parties tend to look out just for their own needs and not for what's best in the country. And of course, don't pick side in European conflicts. If you look back at World War I and World War II, we failed miserably. Now, I don't make my students memorize all of the presidents. I would like you to know that by the time we have Donald Trump, he is the 45th president. Generally, these are the founding forefathers: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Jefferson's the guy who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence. Madison is generally seen as the father of the U.S. Constitution. After Madison, we have the second James in a row, and that's James Monroe. And then the son of John Adams becomes president. His name is John Quincy Adams. And then we get Andrew Jackson, who's on the $20 bill. This guy was rough and tough and a person who the people loved. And he actually is kind of given credit for the mascot of the Democratic Party. If you're familiar with Republicans and Democrats in our country, the Republicans use the elephant as their mascot, and the Democrats use the donkey. The story goes that somebody called Andrew Jackson a jackass, and he thought it was so funny that he started using that as the symbol for the political party that was going to be born out of his ideas, the man of the people. Most the political parties like to trace their roots back to these founding forefathers. Again, Thomas Jefferson, his political party was often referred to as Democratic Republicans. So you can see both political parties would want to lend themselves back to these founding forefathers. Jackson on the $20 bill gives way to Martin Van Buren. And again, there's 45 presidents, and you've already taken a U.S. history class, so I hope you're familiar with a lot of them. We will address and talk about some of them in class. But let's hit a couple of important vocab words, like, for instance, one of the words we're going to throw out a lot is checks and balances. That is, because we have three branches and each one of them have a different job, they're meant to be separate but equal. So no one person or branch gets too much power. This is meant to protect your rights and my rights, okay? That's the reason, and sometimes it means government doesn't function very smoothly, but it also means one person doesn't get too much power. Now, one of the ways that the presidents, at least in recent times, and this has happened before, but especially current presidents, if they can't get Congress to make a law, then they'll do what they call an executive order. Because the president can't make laws, they sometimes get around this by just making an order. I'm the president, and I'm going to make an order. The problem is it's not really a law, and that's where it gets a little bit fishy and a little bit hazy, and the next president can simply undo it. So executive orders are easy to make, and they're easy to break. Okay? It's like a pie crust promise, easily made, easily broken. Executive orders are a way for presidents to, and I'm using air quotes, make laws, but they can't make laws. That's only the job of Congress. If we have a president who is currently in office, we'll often refer to that person as the incumbent. That word could be used for anybody who's running for office, from a mayor to a governor to a state legislature, anything. The person who is in office is the incumbent, and they generally have the advantage because of name recognition. Unless they really stink, and unless people are really upset with them, the person who is in office will win. Okay? So if you're not in office, you want to make that person look as bad as you can, try to ruin their reputation, and that's why politics often get dirty. Okay? The person who is the incumbent, the people who are within his voting pool or her voting pool, who would vote for them, are called constituents. Okay? What are the factors that seem to help presidents win elections? Well, this might be one of the most complicated things that's not complicated. In order to become president of the United States, you need to win at least 270 electoral college votes. We, as regular Americans, don't actually vote for the president. If you're 18 and you vote in the next election for president, you're not actually voting for the president. You're voting for how our state is going to use its electoral votes. That's kind of a little bit complicated, and we'll get into that. How many votes does each state get? Well, you're looking at a map. It's simply the number of representatives that state has in Congress. For instance, in Montana, Montana has 2 senators and 1 in the House of Representatives, so Montana gets 3 votes for president. That's not very much. That's why candidates don't spend much time in low populated areas. Same thing in North and South Dakota. Let's look at California. There are 2 senators from California that we discussed last week in our notes, and there are 53 seats that California gets in the House of Representatives. That means California gets 53 votes for president. So when you vote in California, you're not actually voting for the president, you're voting for how our votes are going to be used. I know that sounds a little bit overly complicated, but we're going to continue to get into that, okay? So here's a few more vocabs we need to understand. And again, if I ever have the chance to use my name as a pun, I'll certainly take advantage of that. I just used the word constituents, people who can vote in an area. So the constituents are So people who are running for office in California, the constituents are the people, and those who are running a campaign or they're up for election. The person who's in office is the incumbent, and the person who's going against them, okay, they're both trying to get the constituents to vote for them. Congressional approval. Often the president has to get approval from Congress before he can take action. Okay, one example of here is the many checks on the power of the president. So we don't want the president to have too much power. One person making choices so quick, that's not very effective. We've talked about the power of the pardon, and that's the power of the president to forgive any crime against the U.S. Remember, the president's job is to enforce the law, so he also has the power to not enforce the law, and that's really the power of the pardon. How does the president interact with the other branches of government, and how has this changed over time? Remember, a bill is a law that's being made. Who makes the laws? Congress does. And once the Congress starts the process, it goes to both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay? Oftentimes, this work is done in small groups that we talked about last week called committees. And if it passes both parts of the House, it goes to the president. If he signs it, it becomes a law. If he doesn't sign it, then it goes back into the process. Okay? And again, I've got the same basic chart right here because I really want to pound this idea in your head. What problems are posed by representative governments, and how can they be addressed? One thing that people hate is how ineffective and how inefficient the government is. But it was done on purpose so that one person, the president, can't just go and change everything just because they want to. There are checks in place. How many U.S. presidents have been impeached? Here's an important word. You might want to highlight this word, impeached. If the president breaks the law, then the president can be removed from office. As of 2020, there are only 3 presidents that have been impeached. The first president to be impeached was way back with Abraham Lincoln's vice president. At the end of the Civil War, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, like a couple days after the Civil War was done. And Andrew Johnson becomes president, and our country was in a mess. We just finished the Civil War. 600,000 people were dead. We were trying to end slavery, which was a fiasco. If you force the South to end slavery, if you're forced to do anything, you don't do a good job of it. And so it was kind of a mess all over the place. And politics as they were, that was the first president to be impeached. But he didn't lose his job. Andrew Johnson stayed in office, okay? The next president to be impeached was William Jefferson Clinton, or Bill Clinton. He lied under oath. There was a little scandal. He was spoodily pooping around with one of the interns in his office named Monica Lewinsky, and he swore under oath that he was not having sexual relations with her, but there was proof that he was, and so he was impeached, but again, not removed from office. Same thing here with Donald Trump, was impeached. He's the 3rd president to be impeached, but again, no president has ever lost their job by being impeached. Impeached is a formal hearing by Congress against the president. There is one president that gave up his job because he was going to get kicked out of office. He wasn't impeached, but he was going to be, and that, of course, Richard Nixon. And he went on TV and he said, basically, effective at noon, tomorrow I'm not going to be president. I'm giving it over to the vice president, Gerald Ford. And so Nixon stepped out of office before he could be removed from office. And ironically, Gerald Ford, the vice president, his first thing that he did when he became president was pardon Nixon. So Nixon didn't even get in trouble. But that made Gerald Ford look really bad. Anyways, I got some great videos on impeachment in general, and of course the impeachment of Trump as that went over. What does the president of the U.S. swear to do when they are inaugurated? This is a fancy word. When the president is elected in November, he doesn't, or in the future, maybe she doesn't take office until the following year, like a couple months later, right? Where they'll have an official inauguration ceremony. So we'll sometimes refer to the person as the president-elect, like we've elected them, but it takes a couple of months for the old president to clear out and the new president to move in. But we'll have a big ceremony in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol building where Congress meets. And they swear an oath, the oath of office of the President of the United States. They have to repeat. Okay, they hold their hand up and they say, I solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's what they swear to do. That's what they affirm to do. They promise that they will defend the Constitution. So you can see why understanding the Constitution is perhaps the most important thing that we could teach you in this government class. Okay? Again, I have some great videos in here, like how to become president and some of the election process. We're going to get into elections later on. But if we were in class, I would actually show this, and it's some great videos. But if you're at home taking these notes, again, I'd recommend you go look at my notes on my website and take advantage of that. At the end of all of my notes, I do have a set of crash course review videos that go over all things like the powers of the president and congressional delegation, how the president governs, all kinds of crash course videos at the end after this where it says review videos. So I'm going to go ahead and close week 4 notes all about the executive branch and the president. If you have questions, make sure you ask those in class, and we'll see you guys next week.